Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really devastating chapter of colonial history, the Great Famines of British India. And we're going to be asking a very tough question about what really caused them. So between the 18th and the mid-20th centuries, while India was under British rule, a whole series of catastrophic famines just ripped through the subcontinent. And the death toll? It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking tens of millions of people.
For a long time, the story you'd hear was that these were just tragic, unavoidable natural disasters. The result of droughts and bad harvests. But the sources we're looking at today pose a much, much darker question. Were these famines actually created and made way worse by deliberate colonial policy? So let's dig in and see what the evidence says.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the economic engine the British built in India. Then we'll zoom in on a specific and truly tragic case study from 1943. And finally, we'll explore the lasting scars these events left on history.
All right, so first things first. To get a handle on the famines, you really have to understand how Britain completely rewired India's entire economy to serve the empire's own interests.
And this all starts with something historians call the drain of wealth. Basically, it's this idea that Britain just systematically siphoned off enormous amounts of resources and capital from India. They turned it into a supplier of cheap raw materials for British factories and a captive market for British goods. And this whole process just crushed local industries and made the Indian population deeply, deeply poor.
A huge piece of this puzzle was a forced shift in what farmers were even growing. Farmers were pressured to stop growing food crops for their own communities, the stuff that provides food security, and switch to growing cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium. These raw materials were essential for British textile mills, and they helped balance Britain's trade, but it meant India's fields were no longer growing food for Indians. And the result of all this? Well, it's pretty shocking when you look at the data. The sources show a major decline in the amount of food available per person under British rule. So while India was producing immense wealth for the empire, its own people had less to eat, leaving them incredibly vulnerable.
And if that wasn't enough, the British imposed these new, relentless land tax systems. It didn't matter if it was through landlords or directly from peasants or from entire villages, the taxes were demanded with brutal efficiency. Even during a drought or a bad harvest, you still had to pay. This forced farmers to sell their precious food stocks or lose their land completely.
Now let's see what happens when all of these policies, the drain of wealth, the shift to cash crops, and these crushing taxes all converge into one horrifying event, the Bengal Famine of 1943.
So, the disaster started with crop failures and cyclones, but it was colonial policy that turned this crisis into a full-blown catastrophe. Wartime inflation sent food prices through the roof. Then, as people began to starve, Winston Churchill's government actually diverted food to the European war effort and repeatedly denied requests for relief shipments. The result was just horrific. An estimated 3 million people died.
So you have to ask, why refuse aid? Well, the source material points directly to this. Documented statements from Prime Minister Winston Churchill that reveal a deep-seated racial prejudice. The core argument in our sources is that this ideology directly shaped the deadly policy of neglect in Bengal.
So here's the crucial point. The Bengal famine wasn't just about a failed harvest. It was magnified by a whole series of deliberate policy choices. A hands-off economic ideology that discouraged aid, grain being exported from a starving region, and prioritizing the war effort over human lives. It all combined to create what many call a preventable tragedy.
And the impact of these policies didn't just stop when the famines ended. Oh no. They left deep and lasting wounds on Indian society that you can trace long after the British Empire fell.
I mean, think about it. These man-made famines traumatized entire generations, shattering social structures and families. They also entrenched a deep cycle of poverty and agricultural stagnation that would challenge the newly independent nation for decades and decades to come.
Now, to really underscore the severity of these actions, our sources make a really stark and, I have to say, highly controversial comparison about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine. The sources argue that while Hitler's method was direct industrial genocide, Churchill's was one of deadly policy and willful negligence. The analysis suggests that while the methods were completely different, both leaders caused mass deaths that were driven by ideology, one of racial purity and the other of imperial interests and racial prejudice. Now, this is, of course, a deeply contentious historical argument.
So ultimately, the sources contend that these famines were not just an accident of history.
They were the predictable, devastating outcome of a colonial system that systematically devalued Indian lives and sacrificed millions of people to fuel an empire's economy and its wars.
And this whole history leaves us with a powerful and, frankly, unsettling question that still echoes today. At what point does political and economic policy, driven by ideology, profit, or prejudice, cross the line and become a weapon used against a population?